In an effort to keep this as short as possible, we'll see how that goes. I want to give you some more information about landscape photography than what you just find in your assignment to kind of verbalize some of these things. Maybe do a better job of explaining them. I don't know, maybe not. But anyways, landscape photography is not as easy as you would think on the surface. As with most things, and especially the things in photography up to this point, a lot of us have figured out that there's a lot more involved. There's a lot of thought, there's a lot of creativity, there's a lot of art, there's a lot of science, there's a lot of techniques that all go into creating what one would consider good photography. And the same holds true for, obviously, landscape photography. It's not as simple as just walking outside and taking a picture of what's over there, because while you may be lucky and live in some area that is very picturesque, most of us aren't, and we have to do some work to create an image that is, in landscape terms, good, you know. So what makes good landscape photography? And that's not an easy question to answer, because it can mean so many different things. It could be very wide or zoomed out, and you're taking a photo of like a mountain and the trees, or it could be very narrow focused and close, and you could be taking photos in a macro form of something like a leaf or a petal or the center of a flower. That can constitute the same landscape that I'm expecting in this assignment. There's just so many things it could be. It could be a barn in a field. But what makes a good picture in terms of landscape photography? And it's about like bringing us, the viewer, into that picture. So before, I've talked about the story of an image, and all I mean by story of an image is, you've heard this whole idea of a picture's worth 1,000 words. You know, what are those 1,000 words? That's your story. What are the things that we can extrapolate from that image and piece together and say, well, what I'm looking at means this thing to me. And maybe somebody else looks at it and it means something completely different. Maybe your picture is much more ambiguous, or maybe it's just right on the nose and everybody who looks at it has the same exact thought. But that's the story, you know, that's what I'm talking about. And for landscape, you may have a story, you may not. It still has descriptive words, and those thousands of words that could go into describing what you're looking at. But really the goal of something like landscape is putting us in the position of you, because you're the one experiencing that environment at that moment when you take the photo. So everybody else, the viewers, didn't have that opportunity. So how can you transport us and put us, the viewer, in your shoes to experience what you experienced? That's really kind of what landscape aims to do. It invites us into those scenes, into that environment, to feel the warmth, the serenity, the light shining down and, you know, on our skin, and it just feels nice. Or the flowing water and the calmness of those kinds of things, or the chaoticness of the crazy wind and leaves blowing everywhere, the colds of wintertime, you know, it can be any of these things. The loneliness, the mysteriousness of like fog in the background. I could go on and on and on, and so could you. But I want to be imported into this image. I want to be there. And how can you use the techniques, the methods, the creativity that you are starting to build on and develop? How can you use that to invite us into that scene, that landscape? And it's going to be dictated solely on what you're taking a picture of. But I'm giving you some directives for this assignment, but I want you to consider these things, you know, all the things that I've said up to this point here, when you're fulfilling these requirements. And I'll talk about those briefly in just a second. One thing that I want to point out that I've not really defined a whole lot is the depth of an image. And it's so important in something like landscape, creating depth in your image. You know, what does that even mean? What is depth? And another way that I've kind of thought about explaining this is, if you consider your perspective, the perspective of the lens of the camera, and ultimately us, the viewers of that image, and all the stuff in that image from there, that way, that's, you know, how deep it is. If you think of it in layers, though, you have foreground, which is up front, you have middle ground, which is obviously in the middle, and then you have background, which is aptly named in the back. So to create depth in an image, is all about anchoring things in space. I think that's probably the easiest way to think about it, or the best way to think about it. Because to take a picture of a tree by itself, or to take a picture of a building, or of a barn, or of an animal, or a person, a mountain, a river, a lake, it's hard to really grasp the scale, the size, and then the relationship between us, the viewer, and that thing, unless we have depth in that image. Unless we have things in the foreground, middle ground, and background that kind of give us reference points visually to put us anchored in space somewhere. Because without those things, we're not really sure how big or how far away we are in relationship to where we are and the thing that we're looking at. Just because I have it in my hand, my highlighter is in the foreground, I'm in the middle ground, my backpack and the wall obviously is in the background. This is not a good example. However, when you're using something like a DSLR camera, or even cell phones can do this now, you have something in the foreground up front, you focus on, like me as an example, in the middle ground, and then the stuff in the background kind of blurs out. The stuff in the foreground kind of blurs out because that's not where our focus point is. But it is because of those things that we have a relationship between distance of me in the background or me and the thing in the front, and also size. My backpack being over here, and because of where it is, we can have potentially a relationship to how big I am by comparison. If I was back here, then obviously it gives a more obvious interpretation of size. However, it doesn't really add any depth necessarily. Actually, it does because this desk, but I'm not splitting hairs at this point. What I'm wanting to convey here is that sometimes it's not as obvious as what I just said. Sometimes it's not that easy to get a sense of space, to get a sense of size and all those things. And depth and this layered technique is a good way to do that. Not only that, is just having that depth in an image in and of itself creates visual interest. It's just more interesting to look at than something that's just very flat. Okay, so now briefly explaining some of these assignment things. S-curve is pretty self-explanatory once you read the prompt here, but it's just something that has that S shape to it. It could be water, it could not be. Use your imagination. It could be a road. We have a lot of windy roads around this area, so I mean, that could be something, but just make it interesting to look at. And always consider the past lessons and stuff to build on, to compile things as best you can, to use multiple techniques to make things just more interesting. The next one is like editing, and we've not talked a lot about editing. And if you have special trouble here, just please let me know. Because I allude to Photoshop and the Adobe suite, which you can get for a discount with your .edu email address, if you didn't know that. However, there's also free trials available. But if you don't have that resource for something like Adobe, then you can use anything. I don't care. However, just take a photo that you initially take with the sole intention of just trying to make it a little bit better with some form of editing. Good editing is tasteful editing, and it matches, your vision. It matches your concept. Those things should go hand in hand. You shouldn't just throw an edit at something just because you can. That should never be the way that you edit anything. It should have a very specific purpose to add to that image, that story or whatever. The next one's macro. Macro, all it means is how close your camera can focus, or your lens if you have a DSLR. That's all that means. However, there is this form of photography called macro photography. And really what that's all about is like taking small things and making them look much larger, or zooming in on them. And this is accomplished because of certain lenses are dedicated to macro photography. That's their purpose. And what it does is it fills the frame or the sensor of your camera with that thing, and it makes it look larger, and thus we're closer to it, and we can see a lot more detail and a perspective that's always interesting. And that's why I think macro is a lot of fun, is because it is just a new perspective on a lot of things that we've never really seen up to this point. And that's what makes macro a lot of fun. The next one is texture. Textures are really nice. Texture is a good way to add visual interest to anything. And this can be, I mean, a crackling texture, this could be sand, rocks, whatever, but just make it interesting. There's a lot of other things that can constitute texture that can, fulfill this requirement. So think outside the box a little bit here. I want to see some interesting things. And the big one here is the golden hour. I got something in my eye, I apologize. The golden hour is a term that is thrown around all the time in photography, and all that really stands for is there's around an hour as sun is rising and sun is setting. So you got like 2 golden hours per day, basically. And what happens is the sun's position just casts light at a certain angle, and everything appears warm. And the angle makes the shadows elongated, and it also, to us, makes colors more vibrant and pop more. So there's this idea that a lot of people only take photos at the golden hour, which, I mean, I don't buy into that. But it is something to be experienced, because there is an obvious difference between like midday photography and something like the golden hour. Given our time of the year, this might be a little bit more difficult, so I understand that. So use your best judgment and, do what you can with this. But I do want to bring it up because it is something that if you've not heard of yet, I would be surprised. Anyway, I think that does it for this assignment. And as always, I mean, if you need any help with anything, if you want me to explain further about certain things, or if you want me to cover something that I've not touched on, just simply ask, and I will do my best to explain what I can to, add to some of these lessons so people can get some information that, they want to know. Anyway, reach out to me if you have any questions, let me know. And I look forward to seeing what you guys do for this one. All right. See you later.